for subscribing. Take a moment to write in the comments what time it is where you are right now. I read every single one. She walked into my house wearing a smile that cost more than most people's monthly mortgage. That was my first thought when my son brought her home for Thanksgiving dinner. Not a warm smile, not a nervous one. The kind you practice in the mirror until it looks effortless. Her name was Serena. My son Oliver had been dating her for about 8 months at that point. He'd mentioned her a few times over the phone. Said she was smart. Said she worked in finance. Said she was different from anyone he'd ever met. I remember thinking that last part was a funny thing to say. Different can mean a lot of things. I'm 63 years old. I spent 31 years as a high school history teacher in Central Ohio before I retired. I raised Oliver alone after his mother passed when he was 14. Just the two of us for a long time. We figured things out together. He became a good man, careful, honest, a little too trusting maybe, but good. He works in IT project management out of Columbus, makes decent money, owns a small house. Nothing flashy. He was always like me in that way. Modest, content with enough. Serena was not like that. She came through the front door and the first thing she did was look around my living room. Not the way you do when you're taking in someone's home. The way you do when you're appraising it. Her eyes moved across the shelves, the furniture, the framed photos on the wall. Quick and quiet. She probably thought I didn't notice. I noticed. She hugged me, called me Mr. Harmon, thanked me for having her over. She smelled like something expensive. She laughed at the right times during dinner. She asked thoughtful questions about my years in teaching, said she'd always respected educators, said society didn't pay teachers what they were worth. The things you say when you want someone to like you. Oliver watched her the way young men do when they're in love and slightly terrified, hoping you'll approve. I smiled at him and told him the green bean casserole was excellent, which was true because he'd made it from scratch and he always did that one right. After dinner, Serena helped clear the table without being asked. Oliver caught my eye over the kitchen counter and gave me the small hopeful nod, like a question. I nodded back. Because what was I supposed to say? That something about her eyes felt like math? That when she laughed she watched my reaction a half second too long? You can't tell your son something you can't yet name. She and Oliver got engaged the following April. He called me from her apartment, voice cracking a little, and I could hear her laughing in the background and it sounded genuine. And I told myself I'd been wrong. I told myself I was a 62-year-old widower projecting caution onto a woman who'd done nothing wrong. I told myself to let my son be happy. I drove to Columbus the next weekend and took them both out to dinner at a steakhouse Oliver liked on the east side. I shook her hand across the table and welcomed her to the family. She tore up a little, said she'd never had a father figure who accepted her so openly, said her own dad wasn't in the picture. I paid the check. The wedding conversation started about 6 weeks later. Serena had strong opinions about weddings. That was clear from the first time Oliver mentioned it on the phone. She'd apparently been dreaming about her wedding for most of her adult life. Had a specific vision. Very specific. A venue outside of Nashville she'd always wanted. A particular photographer who was, I was told, one of the best in the Southeast. A guest list that had grown somehow to over 240 people. A destination rehearsal dinner the night before. I listened without saying much. Then one Sunday in June, Oliver asked if he could bring Serena over for lunch so we could talk through some wedding details together. Those were his exact words. Talk through some wedding details together. I made pot roast. It's what my wife used to make for important conversations. Don't ask me why I thought of that. I just did. They arrived around noon. Serena was dressed well, as always. She kissed me on the cheek and said the house smelled wonderful. Oliver helped me bring out the bread, and we sat down and everything felt normal for about 20 minutes. Then Serena opened her bag and took out a folder. Not a phone. A folder. Printed pages, color-coded tabs, the kind of thing you bring to a business meeting. She set it on the table next to the pot roast. I hope you don't mind, she said. I put together a little breakdown so we could all be on the same page. I looked at Oliver. He was looking at the table. The folder was a wedding budget, line items, vendor contacts, deposit timelines. The venue rental alone was listed at $68,000. The photographer, $14,000. Florals, $22,000. The rehearsal dinner, catering and venue combined, $31,000. There were 14 line items in total. At the bottom of the last page in a clean bolded font was the total. $340,000. I set the folder down on the table. I picked up my fork. I took a bite of pot roast. That's quite a document, I said. Serena smiled. I wanted to be thorough. I know it's a lot to process, but a wedding like this only happens once, and I've always believed that the way a family celebrates a marriage says something about how they value it. I looked at Oliver again. He still wasn't looking at me. That's an interesting philosophy, I said. My family has always done things a certain way, she continued. Presentation matters to us. Honestly, a wedding of this scale is fairly standard in the circles I come from. I asked where her family was from. She said Savannah. I asked if her parents would be contributing. She smiled the way someone smiles when they're ready for a question. My mom is on a fixed income. My dad isn't in the picture. That's why it means so much that Oliver has you. That was the sentence. That's the one that landed differently. Oliver was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached under the table and pressed something into my palm. I felt it before I looked. A small folded square of paper, the kind torn from a notepad. He kept his eyes forward. Serena was talking about the photographer's availability. I unfolded it under the table with one hand while I nodded at something she said. 4 words. Dad, don't agree, please. I folded it back up. I put it in my shirt pocket. Serena, I said, I appreciate the detail you put into this. Would you mind giving Oliver and me about 10 minutes? There are a couple of things I'd like to go over with him privately before we respond. She blinked. Just once. Of course, she said. I'll step outside and get some air. The door closed. I looked at my son. He looked like he hadn't slept in about a week. He said, Dad, I'm sorry. I didn't know she was going to bring the folder. She told me it was just going to be a conversation. I put my hand up. Tell me what's been happening. He talked for almost an hour. It started around 7 months ago, roughly 2 months after they got engaged. Small things at first. Serena had a car problem. Brake issue, unexpected repair. She was short that month because she just switched jobs. Could Oliver help her cover it temporarily? $1,200. He did it without thinking. She paid him back 3 weeks later. He thought nothing of it. Then a month after that, a security deposit situation. She was moving out of her apartment, and there was apparently a dispute with her landlord over damages she said weren't her fault. She needed to cover legal fees, just temporarily, while it got sorted out. $2,200 he paid. She promised to pay him back when the dispute resolved. The dispute, as far as Oliver could tell, never resolved, and was never mentioned again. Then came the investment. Serena had a close friend who was opening a boutique in the Germantown neighborhood of Nashville. Couldn't get traditional financing. It was a sure thing, she told Oliver. Ground floor. The kind of opportunity that doesn't come around. She needed Oliver to commit $12,000 and she'd match it. His investment would return triple within 18 months. Oliver asked to see the business plan. Serena said it wasn't fully finalized yet, but her friend was brilliant and had years of retail experience, and this was the kind of thing you did for people you loved. Oliver gave her the $12,000. He never met the friend. He never saw a business plan. Months passed. When he brought up the boutique, Serena said it was delayed, then restructuring. Then the friend had a personal crisis and things were on hold. The subject started to make her irritated when he raised it. He stopped raising it. He told me there were other things too. A dental procedure she didn't have insurance for. A loan for her mother that she handled on his behalf because it was a family matter and she felt awkward asking directly. Odds and ends that each felt justifiable in the moment and added up in a way he'd been afraid to calculate. I asked him to calculate it now. He pulled out his phone. He'd been keeping notes. I could see it was something he'd done recently. The list had a raw quality to it, like he'd sat down alone late at night and forced himself to write it all out. He read the numbers quietly. I wrote them on the back of a napkin. Car repair, $1,000. Security deposit fees, total $200. Boutique investment, $12,000. Denton, $3,000. Mother's loan, $6,500. Miscellaneous, he had 8 or 9 smaller items going back months. Grocery runs where her card mysteriously didn't work, a utility bill paid from his account, gas money, a plane ticket to a bachelorette trip for a friend, a vet bill for a cat he'd never seen. Total on my napkin, $41,300. I set the pen down. My son sat across from me at the same table where I'd helped him with homework for years, where we'd eaten Christmas dinners just the two of us after his mother died, where I'd told him when he was 15 that grief doesn't have a schedule and it was okay not to be okay. He looked ashamed, which broke my heart because he had nothing to be ashamed of. He'd been generous, he'd been trusting, he'd believed in someone he loved. Those are not flaws. Those are the things I'd raised him to be. Have you talked to anyone about this? I asked. He shook his head. Why not? He looked out the window. Because I thought if I said it out loud, it would become real. And if it became real, then everything about the last year was. He stopped. I told him it was real, and that the last year was still his. She didn't get to take that. We talked for another 20 minutes. I asked him specific questions. I wanted to know whether the money transfers were documented. He said yes, mostly Zelle, with some Venmo, all still in his phone. I asked whether he had anything in writing about the boutique. He said Serena had sent him a few texts about it. Early on, that was still in his phone. I told him to screenshot everything before anything else changed. Then I asked him what he wanted to happen. He was quiet for a long time. I wanted to not be true, he said. I know, I said, but it is. So what do you want to happen? He said he wanted her to answer for it, not in a rage. He wasn't furious in that big dramatic way. He was the kind of hurt that sits low and still. He said he wanted there to be a record. He wanted someone official to look at it and tell him he wasn't crazy for seeing what he saw. I told him that was enough to start with. Serena came back inside about 10 minutes later. She sat down and folded her hands on the table and looked between us with an expression that was calibrated to seem patient and understanding. I told her we'd need more time before making any financial commitments related to the wedding. She said, of course, she completely understood. These were big decisions. I told her I'd also like to see documentation of the boutique investment timeline, including any correspondence between her and her friend. The patient expression didn't move exactly, but something behind it did. I'm not sure what that has to do with the wedding. Humor me, I said. She looked at Oliver. He looked at the table. She said she'd see what she could pull together. Over the following week, I did what retired school teachers do when they need to know something. I was methodical. I went through what Oliver had given me. The screenshots, the Zelle records, the texts. I wrote everything out chronologically. The pattern was clean once you laid it flat. Each request had come at a moment of vulnerability or transition. New job, new city, first big milestone in the relationship. The amounts escalated gradually. Nothing large enough to feel alarming in isolation. Everything designed to normalize the next ask. I also made a phone call to a lawyer. Not to threaten anyone, just to understand the landscape. She told me that documentation of transfers, combined with written communications showing the stated purpose of those transfers, could support a civil claim. She used the phrase financial exploitation. She said it wasn't unusual. She said it happened most often in new relationships, and that the amounts involved here were significant enough to take seriously. I asked her what I should do first. She said, secure the evidence, then have a direct conversation, then decide together what the next step looked like. Oliver asked Serena to come over to his house the following Saturday. He told her beforehand that his father would be there and they needed to have a serious conversation about financial matters from the past year. She came. She was dressed simply, which I noticed. She'd recalibrated the presentation. I sat at the kitchen table. Oliver sat beside me. We'd laid out a printed summary, not accusatory in tone, just factual. Date, amount, stated purpose, documented transfer. Serena looked at the papers. She didn't speak for a long time. Then she said we were mischaracterizing everything. The car repair was a loan that she'd intended to repay. The boutique situation was complicated and her friend had been through a hard time and she'd shielded Oliver from the details because she hadn't wanted to burden him. The dental work she genuinely thought he'd offered. The money for her mother was a family matter that she planned to discuss more formally when the time was right. She was good. I'll give her that. Each explanation had just enough texture to feel like it might be true if you wanted to believe it. Oliver didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, Serena, I have 4 years of my savings in this. I have the records. Every one of these is documented. I'm not asking you to explain them. I'm telling you that I've talked to an attorney and I know what my options are. Something shifted in her face. Not breaking down, not apologizing. Something more like recalculation. She asked if he was seriously threatening legal action against his fiancée. I said it wasn't a threat, it was information. She picked up her purse. She said this was not the family she thought it was. She left. Oliver filed a small claims action 3 weeks later for the documented transfers totaling the amount we'd calculated, minus the dental, which was genuinely ambiguous enough that he let it go. He didn't want to fight over every dollar. He wanted the clear ones on record. I went with him to the courthouse. We sat in a beige hallway on a wooden bench while other people waited with their folders and their expressions. When his case was called, he stood up and walked in and I stayed in the hallway because that was his room to be in, not mine. He came out 40 minutes later. The judge had ruled in his favor on all documented claims. Serena had appeared and attempted to contest each one with verbal explanations. The records were clean. The judge was not interested in verbal explanations where digital records existed. Oliver and I drove to a diner on the way home. We ordered coffee and eggs and didn't talk about Serena specifically. We talked about a camping trip we'd been meaning to take for 2 years. We talked about whether the Bengals had a real shot this season. We talked about a book I'd been reading about the Korean War that he thought he might want to borrow. At some point he looked up from his coffee and said, "Thanks for not saying I told you so." I told him I would never say that. He said, "You could have. You clocked her at Thanksgiving." I thought about the smile she'd walked in with, the appraising eyes, the folder color-coded with his money. "I didn't know anything at Thanksgiving," I said. "I had a feeling. Feelings aren't facts." He nodded. "When did it become facts?" "When you handed me that note," I said. He almost smiled. Almost. We finished our eggs. I paid the check. Outside the diner, the sky was that particular shade of blue you only get in Ohio in late September. Sharp and cold. The kind of day that feels like the beginning of something even when it's technically the end. Oliver got in his car. I got in mine. He rolled down his window. "Same time next Sunday?" he said. "Pot roast," I said. "I'll make enough for leftovers." He drove away. I sat in the parking lot for a minute before starting the engine. 63 years old, retired school teacher. One son, one table with a lot of history. Some things you can't teach in a classroom. Some lessons only come the hard way, through people who know exactly how to make you feel like the lucky one, right up until the moment you count what's missing. But here's what I know. I know my son. I know the note he passed me meant he already knew the truth. He just needed someone to help him stand in it. That's the only thing I was ever really there to do. If this story reminded you of something you've been through or someone you wanted to protect, leave a comment. I read them, and if you're new here, consider subscribing. There are more stories where this one came from. Real ones. The kind that don't end neatly but end honestly. That's all I've got for today. I've thought a lot about what made any of this possible in the first place. Not Serena specifically. She made her own choices and she answered for them. I mean the conditions. The setup. Why Oliver and why then? He was 31 years old. Good job, stable life. A little lonely in the way that quietly competent people sometimes are. He wanted to build something with someone. That's not a weakness. That's just being human. But it was the opening, and she walked right through it. That's the thing about cause and effect that nobody talks about honestly enough. It's not dramatic. It doesn't announce itself. It's just a series of small yeses. A car repair here. A borrowed deposit there. Each one reasonable enough in the moment. Each one making the next one slightly easier to ask for. By the time the folder hit my dining room table, Oliver had already handed over $41,000, one quiet transaction at a time. The mechanism was patience. The tool was trust. And the whole structure only held up because he was a good man who assumed other people were too. I don't think goodness is the mistake. I want to be clear about that. I raised Oliver to be generous, and I would raise him the same way again. But there's a version of generosity that runs on autopilot. That gives because it feels easier than asking questions, that avoids the discomfort of saying show me or explain that again because it doesn't want to seem suspicious. That version is vulnerable, not because kindness is weak, but because it's operating without its eyes open. What changed everything was that note. 4 words on a torn piece of paper. What strikes me now sitting with it is how much courage that took. He'd been carrying this for months, alone, recalculating every transaction in his head at 2 in the morning, telling himself maybe he was wrong, maybe he was being unfair to her, maybe the boutique would materialize and the explanations would come, and he'd feel foolish for ever doubting. That kind of slow self-doubt is exhausting, and he sat at my table and chose finally to put it in my hand. That's what I mean when I think about resilience. Not the dramatic version, not standing up and making a speech. The real version is quieter. It's deciding, after months of hoping you're wrong, to act as though you might be right. It's writing 4 words on a piece of paper when you're scared of what happens next. And the outcome followed directly from that decision. Not from luck. Not from me. Oliver had the records because somewhere in the back of his mind he'd known, and the part of him that knew had kept notes. He had the dates, the amounts, the texts about the boutique, the Zelly history. None of that was accident. That was his intelligence operating underneath the hope, saving evidence he prayed he'd never need. When the judge ruled in his favor, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt something quieter, like watching structure finally stand the way it was meant to. The money mattered less than the record. The record said, this happened, it was documented, and it was wrong. That clarity is what Oliver needed to carry forward. He's doing fine now. Better than fine actually. We had pot roast last Sunday. He talked the whole meal about a hiking trail he wants to do in the fall, and a book he's reading about Cold War intelligence operations that he thinks I'd like. He sounded like himself again, unhurried, curious, at ease. Some losses cost you more than money, but some things you only learn by losing them. Oliver knows now, in a way that no advice from me could have taught him. Exactly what his generosity is worth and exactly how to protect it. That knowledge belongs to him permanently. That's not nothing. That's almost everything.